world. And unlike the first lecture, this will actually be about philosophy of animals in the Islamic world. The second lecture, which you're about to hear, and the third lecture complement each other, because today's lecture is about animal cognition or animal minds. Tomorrow's lecture is about animal ethics. So that's why I'm calling this one, Can They Think? And the next one, How Should We Treat Them? And what I'm going to be doing is presenting you with what I'm going to call the conventional view, which I take to be kind of the standard view or conventional view, that's why I'm calling it that, among upholders of Greek-inspired philosophy, so falsafa, in the Islamic world. And I obviously don't have time to present you with evidence to show that this is in fact the conventional view. I'm just going to kind of present it to you, give you a few examples, and hopefully those of you who are familiar with the tradition will recognize it as being familiar. But then I'm going to show that even in authors who more or less follow the conventional view, they're already grappling with some difficulties and challenges, which starts to undermine the conventional view, or at least lead to qualifications. And here I think there's actually a lot of ways one could think about how the conventional view came under pressure, the conventional view, that is, of the difference between how animal minds work and how human minds work. Or to put it another way, the conventional view really is that animals don't have minds and we do. So there's a variety of ways in which that comes under pressure, but I think it especially comes under pressure from two directions, which I want to talk about in the second and third parts of the lecture, namely ideas from the medical tradition. And so this will give us a chance to go back to Galen and say something again about him, as we did yesterday. And then ideas that I think really come from the Kalam tradition. In that last section of the paper, I'll especially be talking about a really amazing and I think underrated thinker named Fakhruddin Razi, who lives in the 12th century. So first, let's have a look at what I'm calling the conventional view, and this really begins with Aristotle. As I mentioned in the first lecture, Aristotle certainly recognizes that there's a lot of overlap between human nature and animal nature. So as we saw, humans have a vegetative soul and an animal soul, as well as a rational soul. The vegetative soul is responsible for functions like nutrition and reproduction. The animal soul is responsible in particular for sensation, sense perception, and self-motion. And that's basically what animals can do. They can perceive and they can move. And you see that even in the first book of the De Anima. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, Aristotle really thinks of the task of De Anima, his work on psychology, as an inquiry into animal souls generally, or even plant and animal souls. And a sign of that is that in the first book, he says, well, what's typical of the soul is that it is the principle of life, meaning the principle of perception and motion. And sense perception and motion are distinctive of animals, right? In a way, plants move too, right? Because growth is a kind of motion. But the first thing that I think comes to Aristotle's mind when he thinks about a soul is not intellectual thought. It's something like an animal seeing food and moving towards the food. Of course, in De Anima, we do also have a treatment of intellect. In Greek, the word is nous. And famously, this is a power that is only ascribed to humans and things that are superhuman, in particular God and the other intellects that are moving the heavens, but we can leave that out for the moment. We might come back to them in the last lecture. So there's this fundamental distinction between humans and animals that we already talked about, which we find in both Aristotle and the Stoics, namely that humans are rational, animals are non-rational, which is why they're often just called the non-rational animals, like aloga in Greek or ghairnatik in Arabic. And this seems in both Aristotle and the Stoics to be very closely linked to the idea or the observation, the supposed observation, that humans are capable of language and animals are not. Of course, part of what's going on here is the is what is, from our point of view, an ambiguity in the Greek word logos, which famously can mean many things, but among the things that it can mean are reason, rationality, and language, or even word. In the Greek mind, perhaps that's not an ambiguity, but it's just one concept with more than one manifestation, right? So you have what the Stoics call inner logos and outer logos. Inner logos is rational thought, outer logos is speech. And as we saw, Porphyry questions this. So Porphyry attacks the idea that in the form that's put forward by the Stoics, he attacks the idea that animals are not capable of language. And so he says, well, that means that animals are capable of logos. If they can talk to each other or to us, then they must have inner reason. Now, there's been some studies of whether animals use language in philosophy of the Islamic world, including by our host, Luis, and also by someone else who's here, which, namely Thérèse Antoine. So hi, Thérèse, thanks for coming. And this is really interesting. So if you have comments on things like the theory of language that's put forward in Aristotle's De Interpretatione, but in part because this has been discussed in other articles that you can go look at, I didn't really want to get into that so much. I'm not going to be talking at all about whether animals can use language or understand language. Really what I'm focusing on here is what the Stoics called inner logos. So what's going on cognitively in an animal insofar as we can determine that from their behavior. And according to the conventional view, there's a very rigorous distinction between what animals can do and what humans can do. Animals can only grasp particulars, whereas humans can grasp universals. So starting with the animals, in a way this makes sense, right? Because we've already said that what's really distinctive of animals is sense perception. And when you see something, apparently, what you're doing is seeing a particular object. You're not seeing a universal idea. For example, to use Avicenna's or Vincina's famous illustration, which we'll be coming back to, when a sheep sees a wolf and is afraid of the wolf and runs away, the sheep just sees that wolf, and the sheep doesn't need to operate with like a universal concept of wolves or the nature of wolves. Rather, the sheep just engages with that particular wolf and can, for example, see that that wolf is gray. So it's a particular color and a particular substance. And this is going to be true, obviously, for the other modes of external sense perception. Like if you hear something, you're hearing a particular sound. If you smell a rose, you're smelling a particular rose, the scent of that rose. It also holds, though, for other cognitive faculties that Aristotle would ascribe to animals. Aristotle is fairly, maybe vague would be too pejorative a word, but he's fairly general about the cognitive faculties that belong to animals apart from sense perception. They all seem to roughly fall under the heading of what he calls fantasia. Often when people try to translate fantasia, they translate it as imagination, but actually the faculty of fantasia in Aristotle is responsible for more than just imagination. For example, it's also responsible for memory. So to just take those two examples, if a sheep remembers seeing a wolf yesterday, of course, to do that, the sheep would have to survive the encounter with the wolf. So this would be a fairly lucky sheep. So we have a lucky sheep, which has encountered a wolf yesterday and is now remembering the wolf that it saw yesterday with a shudder, presumably. And it's remembering a particular wolf, namely the wolf that it encountered yesterday. It doesn't, again, have to operate with a universal notion of wolves. Similarly, a sheep might imagine a wolf, or perhaps imagine food that it might want to eat, right? Like some nice grass. That's something that Aristotle would think that a sheep could do. But again, it doesn't involve operating with universal concepts, because the thing that's being imagined is a particular image of a wolf or of grass, or whatever the example is. I'm not necessarily claiming that this is all very clear in Aristotle, but it's how Aristotle was understood by the later tradition. So this becomes part of the conventional Aristotelian view. Whereas humans can do this thing that I keep saying animals can't do, according to the conventional view. They can grasp things at a universal level. So they could think about the nature of wolves. You could have, for example, a biologist who studies wolves and comes to grasp the essential truths about what makes a wolf, like what are the essential properties that make a wolf a wolf. So they might, for example, come to understand that wolves are canines and that there's something that distinguishes wolves from other canines. That's all very general thinking about all wolves, which is something that sheep can't do, right? Sheep don't do biological studies of wolves. They just run away from them. And this has an important metaphysical consequence. Again, this is maybe more according to the tradition than to Aristotle. The tradition associates the ability of humans to grasp universals very closely with the idea that we have immaterial souls, or souls that are not tied to our bodies. Our souls can survive free of the body, whereas animal souls cannot. Now, what's going on there is that interpreters of Aristotle are bringing together two things that he says in different texts. So from a logical work called the Posterior Analytics, they're taking the idea that knowledge and scientific, or maybe scientific understanding would be a better translation here. The Greek word is episteme. So Aristotle says in the Posterior Analytics that episteme concerns itself with universals. He says in the De Anima that intellection, nous, does not involve a bodily organ. And he doesn't make any attempt to put these two things together, but the tradition does. So the tradition says, okay, well, intellection is a grasp of universal truths. And he says in the De Anima that intellection doesn't involve a bodily organ. So the power by which we grasp universal truths is immaterial, incorporeal. And it's also, of course, the thing that's distinctively human. So putting that all together, we have the picture that animals are tied to, they have souls that are tied to their bodies, can only grasp particulars. Humans have souls that are not tied to their bodies, can grasp universal intelligibles, which is why they can do science. Notice, though, that it's not as if human souls only do that, because remember, we also have vegetative and animal souls. So we use our souls to engage in nutrition, reproduction. As Aristotle says, we get angry with our souls. Animals can also get angry. Most of what we do is something that an animal would also be able to do. The exception is intellection. And I'll come back to this in the fourth lecture. That's going to be very important down the road. But for now, as I talk about this conventional view of the difference between animal and human cognition, I'm going to be focusing on the kind of human cognition that's specific to humans. So that the kind of cognition that only we can perform, which is this grasping of universals. Now, on the strongest version of this view, and here I think we're really getting into something that Aristotle does not think, but that the tradition ascribes to Aristotle nonetheless, we have the idea, which I think is influenced by Neoplatonism, which is that universal objects are actually distinct from particular objects and represent a kind of different level of reality, which they sometimes call the intelligibles, the ma'okulat, which just means objects of intellect. So a good example of this can be found in Al-Kindi, who in a treatise called The Letter on Intellect says, Aristotle says that forms are of two types. One of these two forms is material and subject to sensation. The other does not have matter and is subject to intellect, being the species of things and what is above species. So notice that what he's doing here is he's conflating what we might think of as a typically Neoplatonic idea, which is an intelligible form, right? He uses the word forms, he uses the word intelligible, or at least he says, he talks about these forms as objects of intellect. And then he equates those with the universals from Aristotelian logic, the species of things and what is above species, which means the genera, right? So for example, the genus of animal includes the species of sheep, and these would be the sorts of things that count for Al-Kindi as intelligible forms. So here we have a kind of dualist form of metaphysics which corresponds to the epistemological distinction that I've been drawing. So we have some psychological faculties, the ones we share with animals, that grasp material forms, as Kindi calls them here. And these will be the forms that are in particulars. And then we have a higher faculty, the faculty of intellect, which grasps immaterial forms, the intelligibles, and these for Kindi would be the species and the genera, so the universals. Now, you might think, well, that's a pretty naive idea and results from a sloppy kind of marriage of Neoplatonic metaphysics with Aristotelian epistemology. And maybe that's true, but you don't have to have that really strong sort of two-level object theory in order to adhere to the conventional view. So let's move to someone who's the most dominant thinker of the Islamic philosophical tradition, Ibn Sina, often called Avicenna, who dies in 1037. He actually denies that there are separate universals that constitute a second layer of reality, which would be like intelligible forms. So he thinks that forms only become universal in the mind. So his general picture of universals is a very complicated topic, actually, but the basic idea is that, for example, if a biologist is studying wolves, the biologist goes and looks at some wolves, abstracts the form of wolf from the wolves, and renders it universal in their minds, but there's no universal of wolf outside in the world. The universal only exists in the mind. So he would probably not like the way Kindi puts it in the passage I just read out, because Kindi is suggesting that there's like two kinds of forms that are out in the external world, namely intelligible universals and particulars in matter. And Messina does not think that. However, he does think that you can connect the immateriality of the intellect very closely with the universality of the ideas that the intellect is dealing with. In fact, he even proves the immateriality and incorporeality of the human mind on the grounds that the mind is grasping universals. Something that might be coming to the mind of some of you who are experts in this area, or even maybe have just read around a little bit in this area, is that Ibn Sina has a famous argument to show that the human soul is immaterial, which is the flying man argument. So to make a long story short, the idea is that if someone had no access to sensation and was unaware of their body, they could still be self-aware, and that shows that the self is not the same thing as the body. Obviously, I could give a whole lecture about that. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about that argument at the beginning of his treatise on the soul from the De Anima, or sorry, his treatise on the soul from Al-Shifa, his encyclopedic work, The Healing. What I'm talking about is a proof that comes later in the treatise on psychology and is actually his real proof for the immateriality of the soul. And the proof is, since the soul includes the mind, and since the mind grasps universals, the mind cannot be in a bodily organ, just like Aristotle said. But now Ibn Sina gives a new reason for this, one that doesn't appear in Aristotle. He says, if the mind were to receive the form that is trying to understand, and if it were in an organ, then it would receive the form the way that matter receives forms outside. So for example, the form of wolf is received in a wolf's body outside the mind. If the mind were in and then we get a particular wolf, right? If the mind were in a bodily organ, then it would receive the form of wolf in a particular way, not in a universal way. But the whole idea of Aristotle's epistemology is that you think things at a universal level when you're using the intellect. That might sound a little bit mysterious, everything I just said. So it may help to give you a contrast case. So think about eyesight. So when you see the gray color of a wolf's fur, the gray in the wolf's fur is a particular. It's also received as a particular in the eye and even in the brain, in the common sense, according to Ibn Sina. actually Ibn Sina has a complicated story about how vision works, but we can leave that aside as well. But the point is that using sensation, you receive these forms as particulars. And the reason you receive them as particulars and are aware of them as such is that you're using a bodily organ to do it. The mind is very similar to that in that it receives a form from the outside world, but is dissimilar to that because it needs to receive it as a universal, not a particular. And that means that it cannot have a bodily organ. Since it doesn't have a bodily organ, the mind is free of the body, right? So it's not using the body to perform its activity. And that means, according to Ibn Sina, that after our bodies die, our minds can live on. Notice that all the other stuff that we share with animals cannot live on. So you won't be able to do, I mean, obviously you won't be able to reproduce or eat without a body, but you also won't be able to see or hear and so on. But you will be able to think because you don't need a bodily organ to think. So whether or not you take the really strong view that we found in Kindi, that there are two levels of forms, namely intelligible forms, which are universal, and particular forms that are material in the outside world, we're still going to wind up with what I have elsewhere called a bifurcated epistemology, which is that we have sensation and the other faculties that are associated with sensation, like imagination and memory. That's aiming at particulars. And then we have intellect, and that's aiming at universals. The only disagreement between someone like Kindi, who's more Neoplatonic, and someone like Ibn Sina is that Ibn Sina doesn't think there are any universals outside the mind, but he thinks that there are universals inside the mind, and that in order for that to be the case, the intellect has to be immaterial. And of course, animals don't have that. So this is a pretty powerful philosophical idea, right? So it gives us a very strong view of what's distinctive about humans as compared to animals. And it actually goes together very nicely with something else we've talked about already in this lecture, which is that the thing that's special about humans is that they're rational, right? Because if you think rationality is basically the ability to use your intellect, it's not necessarily clear that that's true, but that's close to being the truth. I mean, the reason it's not clear whether that's true is that maybe you might want to draw a distinction between the use of rationality very generally and the use of intellect as such, which is really only for scientific understanding. But let's leave that aside as an unnecessary complication. The basic idea is, we know from Aristotle that what's special about humans is that they can think rationally, they can use intellect. And then we find a distinctive kind of thinking which belongs to intellect, namely grasp of universals. And then we make a distinctive metaphysical or ontological claim about humans, which is that they have this immaterial power which can survive the death of the body. So this lines up right across the board and becomes a very powerful way of thinking about the difference between humans and animals. And it also is true to sort of ideas from the Greek tradition they're getting from outside of Aristotle, and particularly Neoplatonism. So this is why it's the conventional view. It's a very nice sort of tidy package, which brings together a lot of stuff that they have from Aristotle and other Greek sources. And it gives them a really nice way of contrasting humans and animals in a way that, by the way, shows us that philosophers are the most distinctively human people that there are, because they're the ones who are engaging in intellection all the time. So of course the philosophers like that idea. Again, I'll come back to that in the fourth lecture. However, there are things coming in from the Greek tradition which militate against this conventional view. So they undermine the conventional view to some extent. And in particular, there's a challenge that comes in from the medical tradition. Actually, before I get into this, you might wonder, well, isn't one reason why the Greek tradition would push them away from the conventional view that Porphyry argued that animals have reason and can use language, and so that should like constitute a real challenge to everything I just said, right? And the answer is that Porphyry's treatise was not translated into Arabic. So they didn't know about it. When it got translated into Latin in the Renaissance, it had a huge impact. And there's in fact a recent book that was published about this by Cecilia Muratori, which basically spends an entire book talking about the impact of Porphyry once he was translated into Latin in the Renaissance, but that didn't happen in Arabic. So the chipping away at the conventional view that we're going to see has nothing to do with Porphyry, simply because he was not available. It has to do instead with Galen, and more generally the medical tradition. So as I already said yesterday, Galen gives us a rather different picture of anatomy, human anatomy, than Aristotle and the Stoics. In particular, as we saw, he thinks that the ruling faculty of the human and also in the animal is in the brain. So remember, he does these animal experiments, which show that the body is controlled from the brain through the nervous system. And he then simply assumes, as I said yesterday, that what's true of non-human animals like pigs should also be true of human animals. So this already has a tendency to complicate the conventional view, because you might think, well, what's in the brain for us is reason, but animals have brains. So aren't animals a lot more like us in this respect than the conventional view would make it out? So that's a little bit vague, but I can explain it in more detail to show you what I mean. So first of all, in the Arabic tradition, it should be said that pretty much everybody follows Galen on this point. So they are encephalocentrists, not cardiocentrists. In other words, they think that the ruling faculty is in the brain and not the heart. There is an exception, namely Al-Farabi, which I think just goes to show what a hardcore Aristotelian he was. So he even wrote a little treatise trying to explain the apparent disagreements between Galen and Aristotle. And he said, well, a lot of this is about terminology, and what one of them might call nerves, another might call tendons, and so he kind of creates a lot of confusion around the issue. But fundamentally, what he's doing is sticking with Aristotle's heart-based anatomy against very strong evidence from the Galenic tradition that the ruling faculty is in the brain. But most people, and importantly in Sina, follow Galen on this, and they have a brain-centered psychology. Furthermore, they're aware of a way of thinking about the soul that comes through Galen from Plato. And this is something that we find in Plato, especially in the Republic and the Timaeus, the famous tripartition of the soul. So there's three faculties or parts of the soul, namely reason, spirit, and desire. Again, I'm going to be talking about this more in the fourth lecture. And in the Timaeus, Plato says that reason is in the brain, spirit is in the heart, and desire is in the liver. And the Arabic tradition absolutely knows about this because they've read Galen's summary of the Timaeus, which says all of that. So it both gives you the three parts of the soul, and it also associates those parts of the soul with the organs, the three main organs, which means that authors who are well acquainted with Galen, like for example, Abu Bakr al-Razi, who lives from the 9th to the 10th century and was both a doctor and a philosopher, and I'll be talking about him more. Again, I'll be talking about him more in the fourth lecture. In fact, I'll talk about him in the third and the fourth lecture, so I'll have a lot to say about him. He follows Galen on this and says that there's a power of reason, the quia nautica, which he also calls akl, which people usually translate as intellect, and that this is seated in the brain. Now, so you can see what I mean about this causing a problem for the conventional view, because remember I said the conventional view is reason or intellect doesn't use a bodily organ, it's immaterial, this is why we're different from animals, right? But Razi tries to get around this by saying, well, it's true that reason is using the brain, but it doesn't depend on the brain in such a way that it can't survive without the brain. So his way of expressing this is to say that the brain is an instrument for reason, but reason can kind of stop using it later on. And an analogy that is sort of suggested by the word instrument and that you sometimes see explicitly in the tradition is that the brain for reason is like a hammer for a carpenter. So obviously the carpenter is using the hammer all the time, but the carpenter can throw away the hammer or get a new hammer. Like that would be reincarnation, right? Getting a new body with a new brain. The carpenter doesn't need the hammer to survive. And similarly, reason doesn't need the brain to survive. So already here we have a complicating factor, which is that reason is associated with an organ in this medical tradition, whereas it hadn't been in the conventional view. Another complicating factor, and so this might actually help us understand in what sense the brain might be the instrument of reason, is that you have to find something for the brain to do other than pure intellection, if you think that pure intellection is an immaterial power, right? Also, you need to explain, why do animals have brains, right? So if you're saying animals aren't rational, and for us, the brain is the seat of reason, why is it that when you crack an animal's skull open, you find a brain? What is it doing there? Especially given that Galen tells you that the ruling faculty of the animal is in the brain, right? So you seem to have this kind of tension where on the one hand, Plato is telling you that rationality is seated in the brain, and Galen, who by the way is the source for their knowledge of Plato, Galen is telling you that there's a very good reason why animals have brains too, even though they're irrational. So I think this is really why we get in the Arabic tradition the development of a theory which is sometimes called the theory of the internal senses. So this draws on Galen and even on Aristotle, but probably the closest we get to a theory of internal senses before the Arabic tradition and in Greek is a Christian bishop named Nemesius of Emesa, who wrote a work called On the Nature of Man, or On the Nature of the Human Being, which is strongly influenced by Galen and was translated into Arabic and becomes influential in that tradition. So there's a long story to tell about the background and historical sources of the theory of the internal senses. But what I want to do is just focus on what we find in Ibn Sina. So the idea here is going to be, yes, it's true that intellect, pure intellect, like the grasping of universal propositions in demonstrative scientific knowledge, it's true that that's an immaterial activity, and you don't need the brain to do that. So that's why you'll still be able to do it after you die, as we already saw, right? Remember, his proof for the immateriality of the rational soul is precisely that the rational soul is grasping universals and that you don't need an organ to do that. In fact, you better not have an organ involved when you do that, because if you did, that would render the form universal. Sorry, that would render the form particular instead of universal. So he needs to find something for the brain to do if it's not grasping universals. And what it does is it employs the internal senses, as he calls them. The thought here, the reason they're called internal senses, is that we have 5 external senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. And correspondingly, we have 5 internal senses, which are seated in the brain. And as you can see from the slide here, which is a picture from the Latin tradition. In fact, you might even be able to read some of the Latin names. Like there's 5 little bubbles here with the labels showing where the internal senses are located in the human brain. So there's 5 of them: the common sense, the retentive imagination, the estimation, the memory, and the compositive imagination. So I won't go into this in great detail, but the basic idea is that there's the locus, the common sense is the locus in the brain that gathers together all the impressions taken from the external senses. The retentive imagination, the mutakhayila, stores them, the things that have been perceived. The compositive imagination, takhayul, can recombine them. And so, for example, if you imagine something like a Pegasus, which is a horse with wings, you've seen wings, you've seen a horse, you can put them together to get the idea of a Pegasus. And then we have something really interesting, which I will be talking about, which is wahm. And wahm is the ability to perceive forms in external objects, which are not strictly speaking objects of external sensation. And he gives this famous example, which is that the sheep can perceive the hostility of the wolf. And then we have a fifth faculty, which is the memory, which stores the forms that have been grasped by the wahm. Let's talk a little bit more about wahm because it's very interesting. He illustrates wahm with the example of a sheep perceiving a wolf. And of course, the sheep will see that the wolf is gray, and maybe the wolf is growling, and it will frighten the sheep by making some kind of noise, right? So that's all easy to explain on the conventional Aristotelian view, right? The sheep can use vision to perceive the particular gray color of the wolf, can use hearing to perceive the particular growling noise that the wolf is making. But how is it perceiving that the wolf is hostile? It must be somehow gleaning from its experience of this sensible object a concept which is not an object of sight, hearing, taste, touch, or smell, right? You can't smell hostility or see hostility. How does the sheep do this? Asks Ibn Sina. And the answer is that it uses a specific faculty called wahm to do it. There's also a less frightening example, which is that animals can perceive affection in their family members. So when the sheep looks at the lamb, it perceives the lamb's affection for the sheep, the mother sheep, and vice versa. And that's also an object of wahm. Because you can't just look at a lamb and see that it's affectionate to you using eyesight, right? If you're a sheep, you have to use this other faculty. And you can see that in a way, this is a significant concession to a more generous idea, a more generous theory about how animal cognition would work. Because something like hostility is not just a sensible particular property like gray or like a noise or like a certain smell. It seems kind of abstract, right? Hostility. And you might think that the sheep sort of even has a general notion of hostility, which it's seeing that the wolf instantiates, right? But Ibn Sina stops short of admitting that. He wants to stick to the conventional view. And this concession that he's making is not going to undermine his fundamental commitment to the idea that it's only intellect that grasps universals. So what's going on when a sheep grasps the hostility of a particular wolf is that it's grasping the particular hostility of that particular wolf towards it. It's not in any way thinking, oh, that's a wolf, and wolves are hostile to sheep, and oh crap, I'm a sheep. I'm in big trouble. I better run, right? That's not what it's thinking. What it's doing is we could almost say seeing, except that the whole point is it's not using its vision, right? It's perceiving the hostility of the wolf using wahm, which is able to extract from the sensible images it's getting from the wolf this property of hostility, and it's reacting accordingly, just the way that it might, for example, react to the smell of grass by eating the grass. So it doesn't have to think, this is grass, I'm a sheep, and sheep eat grass, so I should eat this grass, right? Because to do that, it would need to think about the fact that it belongs to the species of sheep, and that the species of sheep all eat grass, right? But it doesn't do that. It doesn't think about itself or anything universally. And so what this means is that although Ibn Sina has granted a capacity to animals that may sound to us a little more advanced than sense perception or even imagination and memory, and also may sound like it gets the animal into the realm of thinking something like a universal idea, he doesn't want to say that. He wants to say that all the objects and activities of the internal senses are particular, just like the external senses. That's, in a way, you might say that's why he can still call them senses, right? They're all different kinds of sense perception. You have 10 kinds of sense perception, 5 external, 5 internal, and they're all directed at particular objects, and they cannot think universally. There's an interesting passage which I only came across recently through a paper by Thérèse Antoine, which I mentioned earlier, which so she's drawn attention to a passage in Sina's book based on the posterior analytics, his Burhan, or Book of Demonstration, which suggests that animals can discriminate between species. Like, sheeps like to eat grass and they don't like to eat rocks. So they can tell the difference between grass and rocks. And as we're going to see, exactly that kind of example will lead a later thinker, Fakhreddin Razi, to suggest that animals do need to be able to grasp universals. But I think that this passage clearly stops short of that, because he actually says in the same passage, there's a difference between wahm, this power to perceive these properties like hostility and affection. That is not the same thing as intellect. And the reason he's saying that is because wahm grasps particulars, intellect doesn't. Intellect grasps universals. So basically what I've just argued is that the medical tradition, and also in a way like the Platonic tripart theory of soul, pushed thinkers who were more engaged with Galen towards qualifying the conventional view without actually abandoning it. So they admitted that there's a lot more going on in animal cognition than you might think just reading Aristotle, like just this sort of brute force engagement with sensible properties. There's more going on than that in an animal, but there's not so much going on that they're doing philosophy or intellection. They don't have an immaterial power of cognition like we do. That still remains stable. And that, of course, allows them to hold on, allows Ibn Sina at least, to hold on to what for him is an important claim, namely that humans can live on after death and animals cannot. So sheep just die because they have no intellect. We live on and can keep doing intellection after we die. And this is a little bit uncomfortable for thinkers who are not such dyed-in-the-wool Falasifa. In other words, they're not upholders of this tradition of philosophy that goes back to Greek sources. Rather, they're upholders of a tradition which in a way is also a tradition of philosophy, which is more scripturally based, which we call kalam. So kalam is sometimes translated as rational theology or speculative theology. It's basically doing theology using the tools of exegesis, but also using the tools of rational argumentation. And in kalam, you have much more openness to the idea that animals live on after death. So, of course, this would be a big question, but we could get into in more detail, like in Islam, do animals live on after death? And the answer is probably it depends who you ask. But certainly there's material in the Hadith and the Quran itself that suggests that animals may indeed live on after death. In particular, there's a verse 638 where it says, there is no creature on the earth or bird that flies with its wings, except that they are communities like you, in other words, like humans. Unto their Lord they will be gathered, which certainly sounds like they're going to have an afterlife. And in early Kalam in particular, there's even speculation about how animals might be punished or rewarded for what they've done, like the pain they've caused to other animals once they reach the afterlife. So generally speaking, mutakalimun are going to be at least open to the idea of animals living on after death, more so than the Falasifa would be. And I think this is one reason why we have in the work of Fakhreddin Razi a number of passages which explore the idea of animal cognition and basically say, well, if you think about the things animals can do, it kind of looks like they have rational souls, according to Ibn Sina's criteria, because it looks like they can grasp universals, for example, and they can perform other kinds of impressive rational activities. So this is a passage actually that we came across kind of recently in the course of our research on animals in Islamic philosophy here in Munich, in a work called The Mulakhas by Razi. And that's basically going to be the basis for the rest of the talk, which will go maybe 10, 15 more minutes. Before I get into it, maybe I should say a little bit more about Fakhreddin, because he's a less familiar figure than some of the other ones I've already mentioned. First thing to say about him is we shouldn't confuse him with Abu Bakr Razi. And also they're not like it's not like it's its grandson or something. So the reason they're called Razi is because they're both from the same city. They're both from Rai, which is a Persian city which is near modern day Tehran. So they're both from there. That's why they're both called Razi. So that's confusing. But for that reason, I'll call him Fakhreddin, so that I'm not talking about the earlier Razi, Abu Bakr Razi. He's the one I was talking about earlier who draws on Galen and thinks that reason is seated in the brain and so on, or at least that reason uses the brain as an instrument. And there's actually a very recent book by Frank Griffel, which to a large extent is about Fakhreddin's intellectual project. So that's a big topic, right? Someone just wrote a book about it. So it's I think also something that scholars are disagreeing about still. Like, to what extent is he a theologian? To what extent is he a philosopher? What exactly is he up to? So that's a bit of a moving target. But what I would say is that he writes works that are more influenced by Avicennan philosophy. Then he also writes works that are more influenced by Asharite theology. And he writes works that sort of step back and try to pass judgment on both sides and come to a kind of superior point of view, taking the best of both worlds. In any case, he's a very original thinker, very brilliant. And in some ways, I think a good way to think about him is that he's trying to replace Ibn Sina as the central philosopher, thinker of the Islamic world, the way that Ibn Sina replaced Aristotle as the central thinker. So you have like an earlier period of philosophy in the Islamic world, which is very Greek based and very Aristotle based, until Ibn Sina comes along, and then everyone forgets about reading Aristotle for the most part and start reading Ibn Sina again, except way out in Spain where Ibn Rushd of Averroes still thinks it's a good idea to read Aristotle. Ibn Sina becomes the central, indispensable thinker. Fakhreddin comes along and challenges him and says, I can do better than Ibn Sina did, partially by weaving in more themes from Kalam. Okay, so in any case, there are several passages in his works where he talks about the nature of animal souls. And in one work, the Mulakhas, he explicitly says, well, people disagree about whether animals have souls at all. And if they do have souls, are these souls rational? So he gives 4 arguments to show that animals do have souls. And the first and fourth are clearly designed to show that animals have rational souls. And of course, this would be a complete denial of the conventional view. So this wouldn't be like a caveat, like saying that animals have wahm. This will be saying, no, this whole idea that humans have immaterial reason or intellect and animals don't, so that animals are tied to their body, that's wrong, because we can see that animals have rational thought as well. And I take it that the reason he's doing this, especially because the context of where this comes in the work, is that he's trying to suggest that animals may be able to live on into the afterlife. So I'm going to talk about 2 arguments, or really these are more like 2 sets of arguments. So the first one makes 3 points, and these are going to show that animals can perceive universals, which again, just maybe I don't need to say this since I've said it so often, but remember the core of Ibn Sina's version of the conventional view is that what's distinctive of human cognition is that we can perceive universals, animals can't. So his first point is, well, even to grasp something using sense perception, you already need to use universals, because, as he says, if I perceive this particular, so let's use the example that he doesn't use the sheep wolf example, but let's use it just for the sake of continuity. So if a sheep sees this wolf or hears this wolf, then what it's doing is it's grasping wolf and this and putting them together. So in other words, it's grasping something general and then thinking, here's a particular version of it. Maybe you might say, well, sheep can't grasp wolves, but they can grasp, for example, gray. So the sheep can grasp this gray, and that's gray plus what we would now call an indexical, right? So something that makes the gray that's here and now. And he said he deals with this as a kind of part whole logic. He says the concept this wolf, or maybe we could say the cognitive content this wolf, has something in it which is universal, namely wolf, or this gray has something universal, which is gray, because gray can appear in other places too, like my shirt, which actually is gray. And so that shows that animals can perceive universals, and they do it all the time. So do we every time we engage in sense perception. I'm not sure that's a great argument. But the next two arguments or examples are more convincing, I think. The next one is, so remember the two things that animals are supposed to be able to do classically are sense perception and motion. We just talked about sense perception. So here's an example involving motion. Suppose that a sheep sees a wolf and is going to run. So it has to form the intention to run. As he puts it, the sheep has a volition to run. The Arabic word is irada. How does it do this? Well, it directs its power of volition at the running that it's about to do and says, yes, that's an action I want to perform. Now, you might say that this act of running is a particular, right? So once the sheep starts running, the running it does will be a particular running, not a universal running. But, and here's the clever thing, before the sheep runs, the particular running doesn't exist yet. So it obviously can't have that running as an object of its will or volition, because how can you have anything as an object of volition that doesn't exist? So its object of volition must be running in general, and then when it decides to run, so it commits to running in general, and then it performs a particular act of running. I think that's a brilliant argument, by the way. Really, really good. And just like a parenthetical remark, when you read Razi, I mean, his works are hundreds of pages long, and there's something like this on every page. The guy's absolutely amazing. He's a brilliant, brilliant philosopher. I love him. He's also very frustrating, so I also hate him because he almost never tells you what he really thinks. But still, but like at the level of individual arguments, he's absolutely brilliant. Okay, third example. Animals have preferences and dislikes. So for example, they like to eat grass, or sheep like to eat grass. They don't like to eat rocks. And that preference is not a preference for particular bits of grass or hostility to particular rocks. It's a general preference, right? And as he says, like if a sheep sort of gets the impression that there's some grass over there, what it's interested in is grass in general. Is not interested in like a particular blade of grass or a particular patch of grass. It's just interested in any old grass. So again, animals need to have the capacity to operate with universal cognition in order to even pursue food, which is the most obvious thing they can do. So let me give you a little bit of background. That's all that Fakhreddin says about this in this context, but I think there's some background that will help us understand it better. This is kind of a long story, but to make the long story short, as we've already seen, Ibn Sina is committed to what we might call faculty psychology. So in your soul, there are all of these powers, starting with the power of nutrition and reproduction all the way at the bottom, and moving up to intellection all the way at the top. And in between, we have the external and internal senses, right? And also powers like the power to engage in motion. And these are all different faculties. So the Greek word is kuwa, which could also be translated as power. So it corresponds to the Greek word dunamis. Fakhreddin says, this is wrong. There's no multiplicity of faculties in the soul. There's just the soul, and the soul does different things. It's the soul that forms volitions and engages in sense perception and engages in intellection. It's just all the same subject. And one of his favorite arguments for this is that if you ask yourself who is doing these things, the answer is always the same. It's me, and I am my soul, as he says. Another argument that he gives, which I think is a better argument against faculty psychology, is that you can have a single cognitive act that involves both particulars and universals. So for example, when you say, this man, like Louis, this man Louis is not a horse. So Louis is a particular, horse is a universal, and I'm denying the universal of the particular. And so then Razi will say, how are you doing that if you have one faculty that deals with universals and another faculty that deals with particulars? How are you bringing them together in one judgment, which is about both a particular and a universal? So that, I think, gives us some background for understanding why he would want to say that sheep are already using universals when they, for example, engage in sense perception, because he really likes the idea that there could be cognitive acts which involve both universals and particulars, because it helps him make this point against faculty psychology. I have to say, though, that as powerful and convincing as all that sounds, there are other texts where he raises the question of whether animals do this, whether they use universals in their acts of sense perception as we do. And he says, yeah, we definitely do this, but whether animals do is not so clear. And I guess what he means is that since we're kind of looking at the animal behavior from the outside, we can't tell whether what they're doing might be explained by instinct or something. It's like you could appeal to something else other than the deployment of universals to explain what they do. But at least in the Mulakhas passage, he argues pretty strenuously that they do grasp universals. Okay, now I'm going to skip a couple of arguments and going to finish the lecture by talking about a fourth argument, which is very brief in the Mulakhas. What he says is, well, you can also tell that animals are rational. He also uses the word intellectual, by the way, akli. You can tell that they're rational from the things that they do, which are so amazing. So think about the way that bees build beehives. Think about the way ants store up food. And then he says, think of the clever things that mice do. And that's all he says, except that he finishes by saying, this is a very convincing argument. And in fact, he seems to prefer this argument to the more technical considerations that I mentioned just before. So here we would wish, I mean, if only he said more about this, right? It's so brief, it's just a few sentences. Good news, he does say more about this. There's a much longer passage. In fact, it's a whole chapter in his last kind of summa of theology and philosophy. This is called the Matalib. And in this work, Fakhreddin, like I say, devotes an entire chapter to a series of examples of amazing things that animals can do. And actually, the three first paragraphs are longer versions of the examples I just mentioned. So it's bees, ants, and mice, although not in the same order. One of the examples he gives is something that's also found in the earlier Razi, Abu Bakr Razi, namely that a mouse that can't get at oil in a bottle will dip its tail into the oil and then lick its tail. And actually, one of my colleagues here in Munich, Sarah Virgi, actually has a forthcoming paper where she charts the use of this example through a whole bunch of different authors. So it appears in both Razis. It also appears in Jahiz, who is a kind of literary figure from the 9th century CE, who is also a figure in an early Kalam. And Fakhreddin is drawing on Jahiz for some of the examples in this chapter. There's a whole bunch of examples. It's not just those three. It's like, I don't know, there's like 16 groups of examples. And he talks about horses and mules and birds and you name it. So the examples are all drawn from either Jahiz or Ibn Sina. Most of the examples, I think actually all the examples he takes from Ibn Sina are from Aristotle, originally from the History of Animals. And I have a forthcoming paper where I explain all the sources that he's using. So what he's doing here is he's saying, well, Ibn Sina, you say that the power to use reason proves that we have an immaterial soul. Well, animals have reason. And you can tell that from the amazing things they do, right? They plan ahead, like the thing about like dipping your tail, the mouse dipping its tail in the oil. The fact that bees can build beehives out of hexagonal cells, which shows that they can do geometry, right? They're obviously operating at a level that we're at when we're doing rationality, intellectual activity. In fact, he says in the Mulakhas that animals can do things that babies can't, which might remind us of a philosopher like Peter Singer, who notoriously admitted that there are animals that are cognitively more advanced than human infants. Again, there's a wider context for this. and in particular, a wider context for an objection that Fakhreddin poses to himself in the Mulakhas. And I'm going to finish on this, but I thought this was worth mentioning because it's quite interesting. In the Mulakhas, at the end of this this passage about showing that animals have rational souls, he says, well, some people might say that animals don't have souls, and in particular, don't have rational souls, because if they did, then their souls would be just like ours, and that would be ridiculous. And he then says, well, that's not convincing because maybe the souls are just of different kinds, even though they can all engage in rational behavior. It's not very clear what he means. But again, I think we can understand this from material elsewhere in his works. So what's in the back of his mind, I would suggest, is a philosophical proposal that was put forward by a somewhat earlier 12th century thinker named Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, who says a lot of really amazing, interesting things. He's another innovative, very interesting philosopher that most people haven't heard of. But one of the things he says is that different humans are so different from each other that we should probably admit that they have souls of different types. So instead of thinking there's just one human species and everyone is a rational animal, we should think that, as it were, human is a genus. And then there are types of humans within that genus, like maybe the intellectuals and the soldiers and the politicians, right? So these would be the real species of humans. So like maybe Lewis and I are we have the same essence because we're both philosophers, but maybe we don't have the same essence as, say, Donald Trump. So he's actually a different kind of being from us. He's a different essence because he's not an intellectual and a philosopher. He's whatever Donald Trump is. So this is an idea that was put forward by Abul Barakat. Fakhreddin actually agrees with this. He gives extensive, in fact, he says Abul Barakat suggests this, but he doesn't really prove it, but I'm going to prove it. And he gives you a whole bunch of arguments for it. And one of the arguments actually is that animals display the same kinds of diversity that humans do. So for example, rabbits are afraid of everything and lions are really brave. And we think that rabbits and lions are different species. So why shouldn't we think that cowardly humans and brave humans are different species of human, or that have different essences, right? So the thought here would be that the differences in our character traits are similar to the differences between animal species, and that should encourage us to think that humans come in different varieties, have different essences or quiddities from each other. So the upshot of that, as far as it, in terms of its bearing on our question of whether animals have intelligent souls or rational souls, is that they might have souls that are like ours in being intelligent, but different from ours in some other way, right? Just as different humans are different from each other in some other way, right? We can all think we're all rational, but for example, some of us are politicians, some of us are philosophers, so different quiddities, different essences. And in fact, I think that this becomes especially clear in the discussion from the Matalib. I think what his view is that although animals are intelligent, they're not as intelligent as we are. So intelligence is a continuum. Even within humans, intelligence is a continuum, and certainly within the comparison between humans and animals. So he really undermines the conventional view by mounting this whole argument to show that animals are rational to some extent or intellectual to some extent. And that opens the door to embracing an idea that would be more at home in Kalam than in Falsafa, namely that animals can live on to the afterlife for exactly the same reasons that Nsina said, right? They have the ability to grasp universals. But that doesn't mean that a sheep is as smart as a human. Rather, a sheep is operating with intellectual powers and the ability to grasp universals, but at a more rudimentary level. And maybe there are even some animals that can't even do that, like insects, although bees can build beehives, so who knows. So thanks very much. That's it for today.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now we have time for questions, comments.